The Sixth Crusade was unlike any before it. No massive battles, no bloody sieges, yet Jerusalem was returned to Christian hands. Led by the excommunicated Emperor Frederick II, it was a war fought with words instead of swords. How did one man, hated by the Pope but respected by the Sultan, achieve what armies had failed to do? Welcome back, history lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more untold stories of the Crusades. Now, let's uncover the Sixth Crusade, a war won not by swords, but by diplomacy. The story of the Crusades is a saga of faith, ambition, and conflict that shaped the medieval world for centuries. From the fiery zeal of the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, which stunned Christendom by capturing Jerusalem, to the repeated failures and tragedies of later expeditions, each crusade left its mark on both East and West. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, ended in disarray. The Third, 1189 to 1192, produced legendary figures like Richard the Lionheart, but failed to reclaim Jerusalem, while the Fourth, 1202 to 1204, infamously turned its swords not against Muslims, but against fellow Christians in Constantinople. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, aimed at conquering Egypt, ended in disaster due to poor leadership and overconfidence. By the early 13th century, disillusionment spread across Europe, yet the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem never died. The world at this time was in flux. The Muslim world, though divided among Ayyubid rulers, held control of the Holy Land. Europe, meanwhile, was undergoing political and religious transformation. The papacy sought to reassert authority. Monarchs were consolidating their kingdoms, and the memory of earlier crusading failures haunted Christendom. The crusading ideal was still powerful, but enthusiasm had waned, replaced by political calculation and cautious pragmatism. It is within this climate that the Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, emerged, remarkable not for its battles, but for its diplomacy. Unlike his predecessors, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire waged no grand military campaign. Instead, through negotiation with Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt, Frederick achieved what countless armies had failed to do: the peaceful restoration of Jerusalem to Christian control, albeit briefly. This crusade was not a clash of steel, but a clash of wills, making it a unique chapter in crusading history. Background and causes. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, did not emerge in a vacuum. It was shaped by a web of political rivalries, religious ambitions, and shifting balances of power between Europe and the Muslim world. At the heart of its origins lay the struggle between Pope Gregory IX and Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, two figures whose competing visions of authority would define the Crusades' character. In Europe, the papacy sought to remain the driving force of Christendom, using crusading not only as a spiritual mission, but also as a tool of political control. The Holy Roman Emperor, however, was determined to assert his independence. Frederick II, often called the wonder of the world for his intellect and wide-ranging interests, had repeatedly promised to lead a crusade, but delayed for years. The papacy grew increasingly frustrated, viewing his hesitation as defiance. When Frederick finally set out in 1227, illness forced him to turn back, an act Pope Gregory IX interpreted as an excuse. The Pope promptly excommunicated Frederick, a shocking move that meant the Sixth Crusade began under the leadership of a man officially cast out of the Church. Meanwhile, the Muslim world was still recovering from the upheavals of the Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221. The Ayyubid dynasty, Heirs of Saladin ruled Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land, but their authority was far from unified. Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt, nephew of Saladin, faced internal threats from rival Muslim princes. Though he had successfully defended Egypt against the Fifth Crusade, he was wary of renewed conflict and open to negotiation, especially if it would buy him stability. The importance of Jerusalem remained central. For Christians, it was the sacred city of Christ's passion and resurrection, the ultimate symbol of God's kingdom on earth. For Muslims, it was home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, holy sites tied to the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. Control of the city was more than strategic, it was deeply spiritual and political, fueling both Christian and Muslim claims to legitimacy. Finally, the tensions between papacy and imperial power ensured the Sixth Crusade would be unlike any before. Frederick's determination to secure Jerusalem without papal guidance transformed the campaign into a stage for his rivalry with Rome. Thus, the Crusades' causes lay not only in the clash of faiths, but also in the clash of Christendom's own leaders. Frederick II, the Crusader Emperor. Few figures in medieval Europe were as enigmatic and controversial as Frederick II, 1194 to 1250, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily. Known as Stupor Mundi, Wonder of the World, Frederick fascinated and unsettled contemporaries with his brilliance, ambition, and unconventional approach to rule. He was fluent in several languages, a patron of science and philosophy, and a man whose worldview was far more cosmopolitan than most of his age. Yet paradoxically, he also stood at the center of one of the most unusual crusades in history. Frederick's early life shaped his outlook. Born in Italy, raised in multicultural Sicily, and surrounded by Greek, Arab, and Norman influences, he absorbed a spirit of intellectual curiosity rare in medieval monarchs. He studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, often engaging with Muslim scholars. Unlike other crusading kings, Frederick was not driven purely by piety or zeal, but by a mixture of political ambition and rational calculation. His involvement in the crusading movement stemmed from repeated promises to the papacy. As early as 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, he vowed to lead a new expedition to the Holy Land. Yet, he repeatedly delayed, citing political instability in his empire. These delays infuriated successive popes, who viewed the crusading vow as a sacred duty rather than a political bargaining chip. When Frederick finally prepared to sail in 1227, illness forced him to return to port. Pope Gregory IX saw this as yet another excuse and responded with the extraordinary step of excommunicating the emperor. This meant that when Frederick finally launched the Sixth Crusade in 1228, he did so under the shadow of papal condemnation, an excommunicated emperor leading Christendom's holiest cause. This act highlights Frederick's unique position. Unlike earlier crusaders who sought papal blessing, Frederick seemed determined to prove he did not need Rome's approval to achieve success. His campaign became as much about asserting imperial independence as it was about reclaiming Jerusalem. Equally striking was Frederick's intellectual and cultural outlook. Unlike many crusading leaders, he preferred dialogue to war. He admired Islamic culture, corresponded with Muslim scholars, and even maintained a personal interest in falconry and natural science, subjects in which Muslim intellectuals excelled. This open-mindedness, while praised by some, led others in Christendom to question his loyalty. His decision to negotiate with Sultan al-Kamil, rather than fight, scandalized crusading traditionalists, but ultimately brought success: the peaceful recovery of Jerusalem. Frederick's role in the Sixth Crusade thus reflected his complex personality, a ruler both admired and despised. blending reason with ambition, diplomacy with defiance. His crusade was not marked by heroic battles, but by words, agreements, and the assertion of his will against both Muslim rulers and the papacy. In him, the medieval idea of the Crusader was transformed, no longer just a knight of the cross, but a monarch who wielded intellect and diplomacy as his sharpest weapons. Preparations for the Crusade. When Frederick II finally turned his attention to the Holy Land in the late 1220s, his preparations revealed just how different his approach was compared to earlier crusading leaders. Where the First Crusade relied on mass enthusiasm and the Fifth Crusade banked on overwhelming force, Frederick pursued a measured, diplomatic, and strategic plan. He understood that the Holy Roman Empire was stretched across Europe, and he had no desire to drain its resources in a lengthy war in the East. Instead, he aimed to use a relatively small but professional force, combined with negotiation, to achieve what vast armies had failed to secure. Frederick's army and fleet were impressive in quality rather than sheer size. He assembled a force of knights, infantry, and ships mainly from his Sicilian and Italian territories, ensuring loyalty and discipline. His resources were considerable. He was, after all, ruler of Sicily, Germany, and large parts of Italy. But he never intended to launch a massive invasion like the one that had targeted Egypt during the Fifth Crusade. Instead, his fleet was designed to transport a controlled expedition, strong enough to defend itself, but not intended for conquest on a grand scale. The greatest obstacle to his preparations came from the papacy. Pope Gregory IX, frustrated by Frederick's repeated delays, openly doubted the emperor's sincerity. When Frederick fell ill in 1227 and postponed departure, the Pope responded by excommunicating him. This act placed the emperor in a bizarre position, preparing to lead a holy war while being officially cut off from the church. Many nobles hesitated to join him, fearing spiritual penalties. Others saw the crusade as a chance to assert imperial independence from papal interference, and they rallied to Frederick's banner despite the risk. Delays also plagued the expedition. Frederick's rule over the Holy Roman Empire was constantly under pressure from rebellious German princes and Italian city-states hostile to his authority. Each time he prepared to sail, urgent political matters at home forced him to hesitate. By the time he finally embarked in 1228, years had passed since his initial vow, and the atmosphere in Christendom was one of skepticism. Thus, Frederick's preparations were marked by calculated strategy, limited but capable resources, papal hostility, and persistent delays. Unlike the massive and chaotic undertakings of earlier crusades, the Sixth Crusade began as a carefully managed, almost reluctant enterprise, one that foreshadowed the diplomatic rather than military character of the campaign. The expedition and journey to the east. At last, in the summer of 1228, after years of delay and mounting pressure, Frederick II set sail for the Holy Land. His fleet departed from Brindisi, the key port of his Sicilian kingdom, carrying a carefully chosen force of knights, infantry, and supplies. Unlike the vast armies of earlier crusades, Frederick's force was relatively small, but disciplined, reflecting his plan to rely as much on diplomacy as on military might. Still, his departure was shadowed by a cloud of controversy. He was an excommunicated emperor embarking on a crusade without papal blessing, a contradiction that shocked Christendom. The specter of illness once again haunted Frederick's campaign. In 1227, his sudden sickness had forced him to return to port, giving Pope Gregory IX the pretext to declare him unfit and faithless. Now, in 1228, Frederick was still physically weakened, but determined to prove his commitment. His health troubles slowed the voyage, yet they also hardened his resolve. For Frederick, the crusade was not just about Jerusalem. It was about restoring his honor and defying papal condemnation. When the emperor finally reached the port city of Acre in September 1228, he found himself in a precarious position. Acre had long been the stronghold of the Crusader states after Jerusalem's fall to Saladin decades earlier. But it was a city full of tension and intrigue. The local lords of Outremer, along with the military orders, such as the Templars and Hospitallers, were wary of Frederick. Some distrusted him because of his excommunication, fearing they might share in his spiritual punishment. Others resented his arrogance and saw him as an outsider, imposing imperial authority on their fragile kingdom. The initial reactions to Frederick's arrival were therefore mixed. Some knights and nobles welcomed the emperor as the long-promised savior who might restore Jerusalem to Christian hands. Others refused to cooperate, openly questioning his legitimacy. The papal legate in Acre even worked against him, urging the Crusaders not to obey an excommunicated leader. Frederick found himself not only preparing to confront Muslim rulers, but also entangled in political struggles with his supposed allies. Thus, the emperor's journey east revealed the contradictions of the Sixth Crusade. A leader determined yet mistrusted. A crusade launched with divine aims, yet led by a man condemned by the Pope. The stage was set for a campaign unlike any other, one defined not by battles, but by fragile alliances and bold diplomacy. Diplomatic campaign, negotiations with al-Kamil. The most remarkable aspect of the Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, was that it achieved its main objective, recovering Jerusalem, without a single major battle. This outcome was possible largely due to the personalities and circumstances of two leaders, Emperor Frederick II and Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt. Al-Kamil, 1218 to 1238, was the nephew of Saladin and ruler of Egypt, the heart of the Ayyubid dynasty. Unlike his legendary uncle, al-Kamil was more pragmatic than zealous. He had already faced the might of the Fifth Crusade, during which he successfully defended Egypt from a European invasion by skillful negotiation and military resilience. By the time Frederick set out, al-Kamil's position was complicated. The Ayyubid dynasty was not united under a single ruler. Instead, it was fractured among Saladin's heirs, each ruling different territories in Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Al-Kamil struggled to maintain, particularly his ambitious brother al-Muazzam of Damascus. These family divisions left him vulnerable and inclined toward diplomacy with Frederick, as a peace treaty could free his hand against internal threats. Frederick recognized this division and chose diplomacy over war. He knew his forces were too small to launch a decisive campaign. Moreover, as an excommunicated emperor, he could not rely on full cooperation from the Crusader lords or military orders. Instead of attacking, Frederick opened direct negotiations with al-Kamil. His knowledge of Arabic culture, his curiosity about Islamic learning, and his reputation as a rational thinker allowed him to speak to the Sultan in ways few Crusader kings had attempted before. What began as cautious exchanges soon developed into a serious dialogue about the fate of Jerusalem. These discussions culminated in the Treaty of Jaffa, February 1229, a landmark in crusading history. Its terms were unprecedented. Al-Kamil agreed to hand over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to the Christians, along with a corridor connecting the coastal Crusader states to the Holy City. In return, the Muslims retained control of the Temple Mount, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock, as well as continued authority over other strategic fortresses. Crucially, the treaty established a 10-year truce, allowing both sides to consolidate their positions without fear of renewed war. For Frederick, the treaty was a diplomatic triumph. Without bloodshed, he had achieved what great armies had failed to accomplish. For al-Kamil, it was a calculated compromise. He surrendered Jerusalem, a city of symbolic importance, but retained the key to real power in the region: control of Egypt and most of Syria. The negotiations between Frederick II and al-Kamil demonstrated that the crusading movement was evolving. Where earlier crusades had relied on force of arms, the Sixth Crusade revealed the growing role of diplomacy, pragmatism, and political calculation in the struggle for the Holy Land. The recovery of Jerusalem. The most extraordinary outcome of the Sixth Crusade was the peaceful return of Jerusalem to Christian hands, an achievement secured without a major battle. After the signing of the Treaty of Jaffa in February 1229, Sultan al-Kamil formally ceded control of the Holy City, along with Bethlehem and Nazareth, to Emperor Frederick II. For the first time since Saladin's dramatic victory in 1187, Christians could once again claim Jerusalem as their own. The city was handed over quietly, without bloodshed or destruction, a stark contrast to the violent conquests of earlier crusades. Frederick entered Jerusalem in triumph in March 1229. His arrival was both solemn and politically charged. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred Christian site marking the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, Frederick staged a coronation ceremony. Yet it was not the traditional crowning of a king in the presence of the church, for Frederick was still under excommunication. No priest or bishop officiated. Instead, he placed the crown upon his own head, declaring himself King of Jerusalem by right of his marriage to Isabella II of Jerusalem and by the terms of the treaty. This act symbolized both his independence from papal authority and his determination to assert legitimacy over the Holy Land. Despite the peaceful recovery, religious disputes quickly arose. The treaty allowed Muslims to retain control of the Temple Mount, home to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which Christians could not occupy or convert. To many Western Crusaders, this compromise seemed unacceptable, even dishonorable. How could Jerusalem be said to be fully restored if the holiest Islamic sites remained untouched? The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, expressed open dissatisfaction, questioning Frederick's authority and criticizing. Nonetheless, the treaty created a fragile coexistence between Muslims and Christians within Jerusalem. Pilgrims once again visited the Holy Sepulchre freely. Christian clergy resumed their services in churches throughout the city. At the same time, Muslims continued to worship undisturbed at their sacred sites. For nearly a decade, the city experienced a rare period of shared access, a balance maintained by the pragmatic recognition on both sides that neither could easily expel the other without reigniting destructive conflict. To some contemporaries, this peaceful arrangement was a remarkable victory. To others, it was a hollow triumph, secured by compromise rather than conquest. Yet Frederick's recovery of Jerusalem remains unique in crusading history, a moment when diplomacy achieved what armies and sieges had failed to deliver. For better or worse, the Holy City once again bore the cross on its walls, restored not by the reactions and aftermath. The peaceful recovery of Jerusalem in 1229 was unprecedented, yet it was met with controversy rather than celebration. The Pope, much of Europe, and the Muslim world each reacted in ways that revealed the fragile foundations of Frederick's achievement. For Pope Gregory IX, Frederick's triumph was a humiliation rather than a victory. Far from praising him, the Pope condemned the entire expedition because it had been undertaken while Frederick remained excommunicated. To the papacy, it was intolerable that a man outside the church's authority should claim credit for restoring Jerusalem. Gregory dismissed the treaty as illegitimate and even launched attacks on Frederick's lands in Italy, turning the Crusades' aftermath into yet another chapter in the bitter struggle between empire and papacy. In Europe, reactions were deeply divided. Some hailed Frederick as the true savior of Jerusalem, a ruler who had achieved what massive armies and years of bloodshed could not. Chroniclers sympathetic to the emperor described him as a statesman who had used reason rather than force. Others, however, mocked the treaty as a hollow victory. Critics claimed that Jerusalem without the Temple Mount and surrounding fortresses was little more than an empty prize. The military orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, voiced dissatisfaction, arguing that Frederick's compromise had undermined the crusading ideal and left the city vulnerable. In the Muslim world, reactions were equally complex. Sultan al-Kamil faced criticism for yielding Jerusalem, even though he retained control over the city's most important Islamic sites. For many Muslims, the symbolic loss of the holy city to a Christian ruler was difficult to accept, even if the practical balance of power remained in Ayyubid hands. Some rival princes in Syria used the treaty as propaganda against al-Kamil, portraying him as weak or unfaithful to the memory of Saladin. Ultimately, the peace proved fragile. The treaty established a 10-year truce, but it rested on personal agreements between Frederick and al-Kamil, not on deep reconciliation between the two faiths. After Frederick's departure, local tensions simmered, and when the truce expired in 1239, renewed conflict broke out. Within a generation, Jerusalem once again slipped from Christian control. Thus, the immediate aftermath of the Sixth Crusade revealed the paradox of Frederick's success, a diplomatic masterstroke that restored Jerusalem without war, yet alienated the Pope, divided Christendom, unsettled Muslims, and secured only temporary peace. Historical analysis. The Sixth Crusade stands out in the long history of crusading as one of the most unusual and controversial. Where earlier expeditions were defined by epic battles, sieges, and bloody clashes between Christian and Muslim armies, Frederick II's campaign was characterized by diplomacy rather than warfare. It was the only crusade in which Jerusalem was restored to Christian control through negotiation, not conquest, a striking contrast to the brutal conquests of the First Crusade or the disastrous defeats of later efforts. This uniqueness stemmed from both the circumstances and the character of Frederick himself. As an excommunicated emperor, he could not command the full support of Christendom. His force was too small to wage a successful campaign, and his political enemies at home limited his freedom of action. Yet his education, cultural openness, and pragmatic mindset enabled him to build a relationship with Sultan al-Kamil, who himself faced political divisions within the Ayyubid dynasty. The meeting of these two pragmatic rulers made compromise possible where others had only seen holy war. The Sixth Crusade therefore highlights the tension between diplomacy and military conquest in the crusading movement. Traditionalists condemned Frederick's reliance on negotiation, accusing him of betraying the crusading spirit. But others admired his realism. Rather than spilling blood, he secured the most sacred city in Christendom and allowed pilgrims safe access to its shrines. Was it a success or a failure? In the short term, it was undeniably a success. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth were returned to Christian hands, and a decade of peace followed. Yet in the long term, the settlement was fragile. The treaty lacked broad support. and within 15 years, Jerusalem once again fell to Muslim forces. The Sixth Crusade was thus both a triumph of diplomacy and a reminder of the temporary nature of medieval power. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, occupies a singular place in the history of the crusading movement. Its long-term impact was paradoxical. It demonstrated that diplomacy could achieve what decades of warfare had failed to secure. Yet it also revealed the fragility of such arrangements. Jerusalem's peaceful restoration under Frederick II was celebrated in the short term, but proved temporary, as the city would again fall to Muslim forces in 1244. The crusade offered a glimpse of an alternative path, negotiation instead of conquest. But medieval politics and religious zeal left little room for lasting compromise. Frederick's legacy remains controversial. To admirers, he was a visionary ruler, the wonder of the world, who used intellect and diplomacy to outmaneuver both his Muslim counterparts and his papal enemies. He achieved what great crusading armies had failed to do, and without bloodshed. Yet to his critics, particularly the papacy, Frederick was a usurper, an excommunicated emperor who dared to claim victory without the church's blessing. His uneasy relationship with the papacy overshadowed his triumph, and his settlement in Jerusalem lacked the institutional support needed to endure. The lessons of the Sixth Crusade are striking. It showed that political realism and cultural understanding could be more effective than brute force, even in an age dominated by holy war. At the same time, it highlighted the deep divisions within Christendom and the limits of peace built on temporary compromises. Ultimately, the Sixth Crusade stands as both a triumph of diplomacy and a cautionary tale about the fleeting nature of medieval power and the complexities of faith, politics, and empire.